About commodity production and the law of value under socialism. Dyochenko, Doctor of Economics. The Soviet people, under the leadership of the Communist Party, are successfully building a communist society. In this great world historical cause, the party is guided by the all-conquering teaching of Marxism-Leninism, by the historic decisions of the 19th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. The work of J.V. Stalin, The Economic Problems of Socialism in the USSR, is of great importance in working out the question of the ways of the transition from socialism to communism. Much attention in this work is paid to questions of commodity production and the law of value under socialism. J.V. Stalin showed the reasons for the preservation of commodity production during the transition from capitalism to socialism and under socialism, its fundamental differences from capitalist commodity production, the necessity and importance of using forms of value in economic practice. The correct solution of these questions is extremely important for elucidating the conditions and tasks of the gradual transition from socialism to communism in our country and the construction of a socialist economy in the people's democracies. Previously, there was a lot of confusion and misinterpretation among academic economists and teachers of economic disciplines on these issues. The subjectivist idealist idea was widespread that the law of value in a transformed form was in effect under socialism. Many economists tried to solve the problem of the causes and nature of the operation of the law of value under socialism without connection with commodity production under socialism, with its boundaries and peculiarities, with its fate during the period of gradual transition to the highest phase of communism. Individual scientists, on the sole basis that the law of value operates under socialism, agreed to the point that they proposed to apply in relation to the socialist economy such economic categories as characteristic of capitalism as labor power, commodity, surplus value, capital, profit on capital, average rate profit, etc. All these statements have nothing to do with Marxist-Leninist political economy. The operation of the law of value is inextricably linked with the existence of commodity production. Therefore, you must first establish why under socialism commodity production is preserved. What are its characteristics? The emergence and development of commodity production. Commodity production is not production for oneself, not for one's own consumption, but for exchange, production for the market. An exchange product is a commodity. The exchange of goods always means the transfer of the products of labor from one owner to another. Consequently, the existence of commodity production requires two preconditions. First, the social division of labor, in which each specializes in the production of some of the products of labor and therefore constantly needs the products of the labor of others. Secondly, the presence of different owners of the means of production and products of labor, which necessitates exchange as a form of economic ties between the owners of the means of production and products of labor. There was no commodity production and exchange at the early stages of the development of the primitive communal mode of production, since there the means of production and products of labor were common property. Initially, commodity exchange arose in relations between communities on the basis of the social division of labor and communal ownership of the means of production. Only with the advent of private ownership of the means of production did commodity relations penetrate into the community. In the early stages of its development, the exchange was of a random nature. It was not the products of labor specially made for the market for sale that were exchanged, but the surplus of products of their own production, manufactured for their own consumption. Commodity production in the proper sense of the word did not yet exist. Exchange becomes more regular only with the emergence of the first major social division of labor, namely, with the separation of pastoral tribes. But only the subsequent large-scale social division of labor, namely the separation of handicrafts from agriculture, served as a solid basis for the emergence and development of commodity production. Craftsmen's products, already in the process of their production, were not intended for their own consumption, but for sale. Accordingly, farmers could receive handicrafts only through exchange for agricultural products. The transformation of the products of labor into commodities means their transformation into values. The commodity is the unity of use value and value. The use value of a product lies in its ability to satisfy a particular human need. The value of a commodity is manifested in its ability to exchange for other commodities. As a use value, a commodity represents the expenditure of a specific type of labor. As a value, commodities are cloths of labor, regardless of its concrete content, that is, abstract labor, certain amounts of spent labor time. The value of a commodity is determined not by the individual expenditure of labor of each producer separately, but by the socially necessary expenditure of labor for the production of a commodity, that is, by the amount of labor that, on average, must be spent on the production of a unit of a given type of commodity at a given level of development of social productive forces. The value of goods receives its external expression in the prices of goods. Price is the monetary expression of value. In the conditions of private ownership of the means of production, there is an antagonistic contradiction between the use value and the value of the goods, which expresses the contradiction between private and public labor. The fact is that the labor of a commodity producer is essentially social labor, since due to the social division of labor, various commodity producers work for each other. However, private ownership of the means of production divides people as individual producers and private owners of the products of labor. As a result, the social nature of the labor of commodity producers remains hidden. Everyone produces on his own, at his own peril and risk, guided only by his own private interests, not knowing the real needs of society for a given type of labor products, not knowing the size of the production of other commodity producers. The social character of the labor of commodity producers is revealed only in the process of commodity circulation. The exchange of products of labor, goods is the only form of economic ties between commodity producers. This determines the importance of exchange in terms of commodity production. The development of handicrafts and trade led to a gradual expansion of commodity production. However, under the slaveholding and feudal modes of production, the role of commodity production was limited, since the bulk of the products of labor was then produced for the own consumption of slave owners and slaves, feudal lords and peasants, and only a relatively small part was produced for exchange. Thus, commodity production arose and developed to a certain extent long before the capitalist mode of production. Therefore, it is not associated with only one particular mode of production, but existed and exists under various modes of production. Therefore, commodity production cannot be regarded as something self-sufficient, independent of the surrounding economic conditions. It cannot be equated with capitalist production. With the change in the content and forms of ownership of the means of production and products of labor, the nature of commodity production and its role in the economic life of society change. For commodity production to become capitalist, it is necessary to separate the means of production from producers, to concentrate the means of production as private property in the hands of the capitalists, and to transform labor power into a commodity that the capitalist can buy and exploit in the production process. The capitalist system of production is a system of exploitation of wage workers by capitalists. Capitalism is the highest stage in the development of commodity production. Under capitalism, commodity production has become the dominant general form of production. There, not only the products of labor take on a commodity form, but also all the elements of social wealth. Labor itself became a commodity. Under capitalism, the principle of sale and purchase dominates everywhere, subordinated to the insatiable desire of the exploiters to enrich themselves. Capitalism to the extreme develops and sharpens the contradiction between private and public labor, which is inherent in commodity production under the dominance of private ownership of the means of production. Under capitalism, owing to the developed social division of labor and the high concentration of production, the latter acquires an increasingly social character. But this production, social by its nature, is subordinated to the private capitalist form of appropriation of the results of production. The contradiction between the social nature of production and the capitalist appropriation of the results of production is the main contradiction in the capitalist economy. It inevitably gives rise to periodic economic crises. It deepens more and more as capitalism develops, which leads to the ruin of small and medium producers, further concentration of the means of production in the hands of the exploiters, centralization of capital, to a monstrous increase in the exploitation of the working people, to the absolute and relative impoverishment of the masses. Commodity production in the transition period from capitalism to socialism. Capitalist relations of production have long ago entered into antagonistic contradiction with the productive forces and have become their fetters. The further preservation of capitalist production relations contradicts the needs of the development of the productive forces of society and brings unprecedented suffering to the working people. In order to eliminate this contradiction, it is necessary, in accordance with the requirements of the economic law of the obligatory correspondence of production relations to the nature of the productive forces, to abolish the system of exploitation, to transfer the means of production to public ownership, to abolish bourgeois production relations and to create new, socialist production relations. This is the task of the proletarian revolution. The Great October Socialist Revolution smashed capitalism in our country. The Soviet state, relying on the requirements of the economic law of the obligatory correspondence of production relations to the nature of the productive forces, abolished landlord ownership of land, nationalized all land in the country, took away the means of production from the bourgeoisie and turned factories, plants, land, railways, banks into the property of the entire people, into public property. However, this has not yet eliminated the need for commodity production. To eliminate commodity production, it is necessary to transform all means of production and the entire aggregate product of production into a public property, which presupposes a high concentration of means of production. Such concentration is prepared by the capitalist mode of production, but far from uniformly in different branches of production. A particularly large lag is characteristic of the development of agriculture under capitalism. Nowhere but England has capitalism completed the painful process of ruining and proletarianizing small and medium-sized producers. In all other capitalist countries, along with large, highly concentrated industry, prepared for direct socialization through the expropriation of the expropriators, there is also a large class of small and medium-sized owners, producers in the countryside. The presence of this class is by no means an obstacle to the victory of the proletarian revolution and the beginning of the construction of socialism. Only the enemies of the working people can argue that the proletariat should not take power into its own hands until capitalism ruins all small and medium individual producers, turns them into farm laborers, thereby concentrating the means of production in agriculture. This attitude of the Mensheviks and other enemies of Marxism was resolutely swept aside by the Bolsheviks. But even after the victory of the proletarian revolution and the expropriation of large capitalist property for a more or less long period, private property of small and medium individual producers, mainly peasant farms with their backward technology, remains. To build socialism, it is necessary to overcome the backwardness and fragmentation of agricultural production. Enemies of the people tried to impose on the party the path of expropriation of small and medium-sized producers in the countryside. Such a path would inevitably lead to a split in the alliance between the working class and the peasantry, and thus to the defeat of the proletarian revolution, to the restoration of capitalism. The Communist Party exposed the intentions of the enemies of the people and resolutely rejected these counter-revolutionary proposals. The only possible and expedient for the victory of socialism is the path of development outlined by V. I. Lenin and has fully justified itself in the history of socialist construction in our country. This path boils down to the following: 1. Not to miss favorable conditions for the seizure of power by the proletariat; 2. To expropriate the means of production in industry by means of their nationalization; 3. Not to expropriate small and medium individual producers, but to gradually unite them into production cooperatives, that is, into large agricultural enterprises, collective farms; 4. By developing industry in every way, to provide collective farms with a modern technical base for large-scale production, strenuously supplying them with first-class tractors and other machines. 5. For the economic link between town and country, industry and agriculture, preserve commodity production as the only form of economic ties with the city acceptable for the peasantry, developing Soviet trade in every possible way and ousting all and any capitalists from commodity circulation. Thus, the preservation of commodity production in the transition period from capitalism to socialism was dictated primarily by the existence of a large class of small and medium-sized isolated producers' peasant farms. But this commodity production was already fundamentally different not only from capitalist commodity production, but also from commodity production of all earlier socio-economic formations. Moving the decisive means of production into public property by expropriation of the landlords and capitalists has created new, unprecedented economic conditions, determine the root changes in the content and purpose of commodity production. Earlier, before the victory of the socialist revolution, commodity production was always based on private ownership of the means of production. For the first time in world history after the victory of the Great October Socialist Revolution in the USSR, commodity production began to exist in conditions when the decisive means of production were transferred to the ownership of society and a large share of the total social product began to be produced at socialist enterprises. During the transition period from capitalism to socialism, the country's economy was diversified. The main socio-economic structures were the socialist structure, which consisted mainly of enterprises based on public property, and the small-scale commodity structure, represented by numerous small and medium-sized proprietors and producers. Along with them, there was a capitalist structure in the form of kulak farms, private trade, etc. The economy of the transition period is characterized by an irreconcilable struggle between socialism and capitalism according to the Leninist formula who is who. The entire policy of the Communist Party and the Soviet state during the transition period was aimed at ensuring victory over capitalism, solving the problem of whom in favor of socialism. Commodity production, exchange through purchase and sale were then, first of all, a form of economic connection between the socialist and small-scale commodity systems, used by the Communist Party to strengthen the economic link between socialist industry and peasant farms and to strengthen the leading role of the working class and socialist industry in the entire economy of the country. This determined the main features of commodity production and circulation under the new conditions in comparison with commodity production and circulation under capitalism. Given the predominance of the small-scale commodity structure in the countryside, a certain freedom of commodity circulation inevitably led to a certain revival of the capitalist elements, who strove to use commodity relations to fight the socialist elements of the economy. Therefore, in the period of transition from capitalism to socialism, the use of commodity production and trade by the Soviet state in the interests of the victory of socialism proceeded under conditions of a fierce class struggle. For these reasons, commodity relations in the transition period from capitalism to socialism were of a dual nature, which distinguishes them from commodity relations under socialism. This stemmed from the specifics of the economic conditions of the transition period and found its expression in the dual character of NEP. Enemies of the people, the restorers of capitalism tried to impose party's fatal path of unleashing market forces, arguing that the whole essence of the NEP is reduced to the assumption of private trade, that trade and monetary circulation under the NEP supposedly imbued with the principles of the capitalist economy, remain the same as under capitalism. Stalin subjected these assertions to devastating criticism and, as early as 1925, showed that under the dictatorship of the proletariat, thanks to the dialectics of our development, the functions and purpose of trade and money circulation change fundamentally, radically, change in favor of socialism, to the detriment of capitalism. In the struggle against the capitalist elements, the socialist elements of our economy have mastered the methods and weapons of the bourgeoisie to overcome the capitalist elements, successfully using them to build the socialist foundation of our economy. This was possible because the nature, role and direction of development of commodity production and circulation in the transition period from capitalism to socialism were determined not by small-scale commodity production, not by its tendency to generate capitalism, but by such decisive factors as the concentration of economic commanding heights in the hands of the proletarian state, such as withdrawal of land from the sphere of sale and purchase. Labor power in socialist industry was no longer a commodity. The basic means of production also ceased to be commodities. With the development of socialist production and the ousting of private capitalist elements from the sphere of production and circulation, the organized market became more and more decisive. Under the leadership of the Communist Party, the Soviet state used the economic opportunity to put commodity production and trade turnover at the service of socialism, to prevent free play of prices on the market. The Soviet state used commodity production and circulation to fight the capitalist elements, for the socialist alteration of the small-scale commodity order, for the rapid development and strengthening of the socialist order, for the victory of socialism in town and country. Thus, already in the period of transition from capitalism to socialism, commodity production and circulation were fundamentally, radically different from commodity production and circulation under capitalism.